Okay, so we're recording now. So I wanted to look, so we left historically off last time, if that's a real sentence, at 1983 or so. And we were looking at how Vibeke Sorensen, Tom DeWitt, ditto, and Dean Winkler were using newfound technologies that were found in TV stations and so forth, very expensive things, to create 3D art in the 2D screen of a computer. So things like spinning cubes and being able to have these sort of effects that were largely on specialized hardware that was very expensive. So sort of the beginning of graphics cards, really, but just dedicated signal processing for image and 3D space. So the 80s, as you may know, is the time, by the end of the 80s, we will have personal computers, right, that people start to have in their home. This is different than what we've seen up to this point, where having a computer is something that not many people do, right? And the general purpose computer is a computer that works for almost any purpose, right? So one of those purposes will be to do the sort of thing that we've been looking at. And the question kind of becomes, or does become, how did that go? What do people actually do? Because the experience with computers in the mid to late 80s and the early 90s is nothing like what we do now. It's a very non-real-time pursuit in many ways. So to give you an idea, it was probably, so in the late 80s, I had a personal computer. I had an Atari 800. And mainly I just played games on it. And there was a notation program on it, actually a music creation program. And I was able to write some of my early works there. I like to make the notes go as fast as possible. That was what was fun to me. My friend had a Commodore 64, so that's 64K. And so on that sort of computer, you could start loading a game and then go take a break to get some ice cream or whatever, and come back a little bit later, and maybe the game would be loaded by that point. So the idea of making real-time graphics on a personal computer in the late 80s is not a thing that really happens, right? It's slow. And the interface for the computer at that point was not one like it is now, right? So I think by the end of the 80s, there was definitely the mouse and keyboard. But the way we worked in the mid 80s, at least, was not with a mouse and keyboard. We worked with, a keyboard. So you just typed in what you wanted. If you wanted to launch a program, you went into DOS or whatever you were working with, and you launched a program that way, which is, not something you're unfamiliar with, right? So going into whichever command prompt and working that way is something sometimes you have to do. So in about in the 80s, the way to do sort of personal computer work with sound is kind of similar to how it looks doing it with visuals, right? So we start being able to use text files, just a text document. So this is kind of amazing if you think about it. To type in text into a text document and feed that into a program, and it will make 3D images, or it will make music, right? So being able to just write in a text document a description of sound, for example, and being able to play back that sound as a sound from a text document. Which I don't think is something that you think is incredible, but in a way it is, right? For those of you that were around a year ago, we were doing this in Super Collider, right? You write a bunch of text in a document, and somehow magically you're making music. It seems incredible. And that is also the case with how people would make 3D scenes on a personal computer. So we'll look at a couple examples of that today. So one is by Joran Rudy. And these are things you actually won't see anywhere. They are not available online. It so happens that when I was really into this sort of thing, I bought a DVD of Joran Rudy's visual music. And it turns out to be quite prescient. This is made in the early 90s into the mid 90s. So a little bit further along than the era we're talking about, but still using the same tools. And the other thing we'll look at is Bill Alves, who still lives out in California. And he also was someone using the same tools as Joran Rudy to make visual music using these early personal computer tools, which have a direct sort of legacy to the way we're working, although the way we work is a little easier than what they had to do. Bill Alves wrote in this article that ends up in the Computer Music Journal in the winter of 2005. So in the winter of 2005, there's a Computer Music Journal, a whole issue devoted strictly to visual music. And I recommend it. So Joran Rudy is in that, Bill Alves, Randy Jones, and several others that are influential. And 2005 is 16 years ago, so I guess that's historical now. But I remember when that issue came out. It was interesting. And so Bill Alves, who I guess I'll talk about first, is someone who's in the direct lineage of John Whitney motion graphics. So he actually hangs out with John Whitney for a little bit. And he says about that, he talks about visual harmony. And I won't read a lot of this article, although if I find a need to do it, I might read some. But what Bill Alves says is that John Whitney did really amazing work with consonance and dissonance in the idea of digital harmony. And I'll explain a little bit about exactly what we mean by that, although we've talked about it informally. And what he says is unfortunate is that there was never a time when John Whitney really started cementing these ideas that he attempted to create an audio-visual representation of that. So, from John Whitney and James Whitney's early work with a pendulum to create sine waves, stacked sine waves on a optical film track, that's really very interesting. And somehow that idea just kind of died away for them, which is really unfortunate. Because later when John Whitney is working with motion graphics in the computer, he's discovering things that are directly related to music. And so Bill Alves kind of takes up that mantle and says, well, what does it mean then to translate these ideas into something musical? And the idea with this is that if we go back a long way to how it is that we tune things, Pythagoras has a lot to say about this. So the way we tune things is is roughly now based on ratios. So if we want to define an octave based on a pitch, then we say that an octave is 2 times the frequency. It is at a 2-to-1 ratio. And that's how we base most of Western music, is off of that particular very consonant interval. The only interval more consonant would be 1-to-1, right, a unison. The next most consonant interval would be a fifth, which is 3/2. And then the next most consonant interval would be the inversion of that, the fourth, 4/3. And so on. So if we keep going, depending on which system we use, now Pythagoras wouldn't have used the system I'm about to say, but the next most consonant interval is a third, which is 5/4. And so you start to see that the lower numbers, the lower ratios, interval ratios, 3-to-2, 4-to-3, 5-to-4, these are our most consonant intervals, right? There's something about the relationship of those ratios that makes them pleasing to us. Now, the truth of the matter is that in Pythagoras' time, he was much more interested in the fifth as being the next most consonant interval and the most useful one. Why isn't an octave very useful for discovering other pitches? Well, because you always end up with the octave, right? C, 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 so we don't get any different notes. So the only time you get different notes is when you use 3/2. And then you go around the circle of fifths, which is very common to us, right? So C to G, G to D, D to A, there we go. And we have basically the system of tonality that we use. But Pythagoras was really stuck on the fifth. And so the way he derived any note, so for instance, to go from C to G is the first fifth. How do I define D? He would say, well, you go up another fifth. So then we would get C to G, that's 3/2. And then if we go up again, multiply 3/2 by 3/2, we get 9/4, which of course is an octave up, right? Because 8/4 would be the octave, so 9/4 gets us the next step up. So it's the same as saying 9/8, which is the D, the second. And then we continue on. So how do we get the sixth, right? How do we get an A? And we would do that by multiplying 9/8 by 3/2, so 27/16. And suddenly we're starting to drift into numbers that are kind of high, right? So then how do we get the E, which is the major third? Well, then we end up getting 81/64. And those numbers are very high. And so you can imagine that particular major third sounds nasty. It's gross. It is not consonant. Because the harmonics don't line up. The 81st and the 64th harmonic will be in common, but we don't hear those. So anyway, there's this whole, and that, we could do a whole class on tuning systems and how we got from there to here, right? Because the tuning system we use now is not a tuning system anymore. We're tempered. And so we actually have to use irrational numbers. We don't have integer ratios anymore. So a piano is tuned to the 12th root of 2. So dividing a curve, still an octave ratio, but along 12 equal parts, requires logarithms. And so now we're a little bit divorced from that. But there are still people, so for instance, Lou Harrison was one of the composers that very much was into tuning systems. So Harry Partch, Lou Harrison, various others talk about just intonation, and their whole musical idea, well, not their whole music idea, but their idea of interval is based on this idea of ratio. So they will choose to use different intonation systems and to not throw away the idea of tuning, which is what has happened with the piano. To go on a little bit of a tirade, that someone comes in to someone's office in the middle of the night and tunes the piano, and the piano player accepts that as being okay. There are very few piano players that really know even how their instrument is tuned, which I find to be totally shocking, that we throw away this whole idea of music, right, and just leave it in the hands of arbitrary people that serve as custodians for the piano. Anyway, tuning is important and kind of gets to the heart of things. So Bill Alves talks about how John Whitney approaches this. Sorry, that was a long way around, but here we are. And John Whitney says that, it's interesting that if I move a dot around a circle at a certain rate, that it will come to the top of the circle at some point. And if I move something around the circle at twice the rate, then at some point they do meet each other at the top of the circle again. One has to go around twice and one has to go around 3 times. And then if I add a third thing that's 3 times the initial frequency, then at some point, right, they meet again back at the top, but it's a little bit more complex about when they come into sync, when they become consonant, right? And the points in between can show us dissonances, right? They are not aligned, and then they align. So that's basically the whole idea of John Whitney, right? To sum it up very, very simply, is this idea of going apart and coming together, which he describes as a digital harmony, which has its basis in Pythagorean roots, right? So what we just described was a unison, an octave, and a fifth, right? And where those might come together. All right, so Bill Alves says about this that Whitney describes this as differential dynamics, is his term for it. And I just told you what that was. And let me find this point. Okay. So earlier artists, and this is Bill Alves speaking in his article, Digital Harmony of Sound and Light, from the 2005 Computer Music Journal. However, though artists speak of color harmony, right, so he's talking about the early color light organs and things like that, attempts to create a direct mapping of color relationships to the immediacy of musical consonance and dissonance have largely failed. So there you have it. Bill Alves just says it, that mapping color to musical consonance and dissonance doesn't work. Not working. To Whitney, such a direct synesthetic mapping of music's most basic parameters, pitch, loudness, and so forth, failed to capture the expressive vision of great works of music, which to him depended directly on multidimensional interplay of tension and resolution. Moreover, he advocated an approach in which animation, instead of being a direct representation of music, corresponds to this higher level of aesthetic intention, creating what he termed complementarity, which is another musical term, usually used in 12-tone rose set theory. So what is he saying there exactly, right? Because I think that's a really concise paragraph to say that mapping things directly, color to sound, light colors to sound waves, doesn't work. And in fact, any such direct mapping isn't really successful. That what we would need to do is find some sort of deeper connection between music and other media. And that deeper connection for John Whitney comes in what we just said, right? Ratios of tuning. Like those seem to be complementary across both things, right? So instead of trying to say some direct correlation, we find some sort of deeper correlation that gets to the heart of what things are. And, you know, Pythagoras was all about this. To him, music was these things, right? And we could take that same idea and apply it to rhythm, that we have consonant rhythms and dissonant rhythms. So for instance, a 1 against 1 is very consonant rhythm. A 2 against 1, very comprehensible. 3 against 2, pretty good. 4 against 3, got that, passed the golden butter. Passed the golden butter. 5 against 4, getting tougher, right? 6 against 5, 81 against 64, no way. Right? So all these things are musically seem to make sense, right? This idea of ratio. And anyway, there's a lot to talk about there, but I'm gonna not try to go too deep into that. I'll just recommend that you I'll recommend that you look at the Bill Alves article, which goes into great detail. So what does Bill Alves do with this information, right? So Bill Alves has sort of an interesting outlook. He likes Lou Harrison and writes lots of papers about Lou Harrison, who's a composer, as I said, from the mid 20th century, works a lot with tuning systems. And in conjunction with that is sort of interested in an Eastern-Western fusion, right? So Lou Harrison takes a lot of ideas from this Eastern-Western fusion, which shouldn't be a big surprise because of where Greece lies, both culturally and geographically, is situated right between those two worlds. So Pythagoras, in some way, is sort of the Eastern-Western connection. Anyway, so Bill Alves has this sort of interest in this Eastern-Western fusion as well. And one of the things he looks at is Islamic patterns. So if you've ever seen Islamic art, mosaic art, there's these sort of interesting patterns that interweave, again, based on ratios. And Bill Alves becomes very interested in the idea of what that is and how that relates to music and how it relates to this idea of consonance and dissonance, differential dynamics. And the way Bill Alves is working is he's working with two programs. So he works with CSound. So CSound is a direct descendant of the music in languages that Max Matthews was developing at Bell Labs, 1957. So we talked about that earlier, how there's this digital music processing going on. I mean, Laurie Spiegel was part of this, sort of using the groove system that was a digital interface to more analog things. But there's also, with F. Richard Moore and Max Matthews and Jean-Claude Rizet, this exploration of how do we make music with text files. And they're doing that with Music 1, which becomes Music 2, which becomes Music 3, which becomes Music 4, 4C, which becomes Music 5, which is very stable, which becomes Music N, right? Well, whatever, we're just going to use this this basic kernel as the thing that brings us everywhere. So Max is a variant of the Music N languages. Super Collider is a variant of the Music N languages. CSound is a very direct lineage of the Music N languages and looks quite similar. C Music is another one. Okay, so we've got all these things. What do they look like, the CSound sort of thing? Well, I will show you what it looks like. So right here, this is a CSound orchestra and score. CSound, by the way, is the first text-based programming for sound I learned. So here, if we look, right here is the instrument, and it says, here's my sample rate, here's my block rate. Don't worry about what that means right now. 10 times 4410 is 44100. Number of channels is 1. This is my instrument, right? And it says audio out 1. We're going to put an oscillator out. It's going to have an amplitude, a frequency, which are defined by parameters. So we don't know what they are now. We will tell you later. And then we put out the output A1, so this oscillator. So this is going to make probably a sine tone. So this is the score, right? So we define in this sort of text way a sound. It's interesting. And then additionally after that we have the score, which says that using this table, so this is an 8,192 point table with a sine tone in it. Believe me, there's no way to know that except looking at the manual. And here's the very first event. So in a CSound score, you would normally have many, many events. But this one says, at time 0, play a 1,000 hertz tone. I think this is maybe for 1 second. I can't remember. And this 20,000 may actually be the amplitude, believe it or not. Because we're dealing with 16 bits, there's actually 65,384 numbers to represent an amplitude. So this would be like mezzo piano, I guess. I think that's true. Anyway, so this is how you wrote music if you were on an Amiga computer in 1988. And in fact, how you wrote music even in the year 2000 if you wanted to do computer music. So around the same time, Super Collider came out. And when I was working with CSound, you can imagine my joy in Super Collider because none of this worked in real time at all. So what you would do is you would program your instrument and you would program your score. And they were actually two different files usually. And you would queue those up on a mainframe computer to be rendered at whatever rate it renders things, which was not fast. So you would leave and then come back later to hear what you had done. And I remember doing this. I bought a computer to be able to do this faster. And it would still, if things were complicated, it would take overnight to render things. It was painful. Not nearly as painful, though, as rendering visuals. Yes, Tyler.
Sorry, would you just like wake up in the middle of the night to like a sine tone just blaring?
Oh no, it would write the file to your computer. It wouldn't play it for you.
Oh, okay.
You'd have to go and retrieve it. Yeah, so if I was working on the mainframe on campus, then I would have to go to campus. I think I could actually get in remotely, but I always just went to campus. And you would have to then go and find the file where you wrote it and then play it back via command line, play this file, which sounded terrible. But it was very exhilarating. So I would sit in the parking lot of like outside Costco or something like that, and I would just sit with a piece of paper and write out CSound scores. That's how I wrote music, and I could do that offline, right? And I could just imagine it in my head about what's going to happen or what I thought was going to happen. And yeah.
Wow.
So you can imagine that generating this sort of list of things usually requires you to be a little more algorithmic in your thinking. And in fact, how we make pitches at all is with frequency. So we are open to the idea that we can make any sort of tuning system we want in a program like this, which is great, right? So Bill Alves has step 1 to doing what he needs to do. Step 2 to doing what he needs to do is the POV Raytracer. And so here is a brief history of the POV Raytracer. So POV Raytracer is like, as CSound is to music, POV Raytracer is to 3D scenes that now we make so easily with jet.world, and it just pops up all sorts of stuff. Okay, so this is from David Buck, who is the creator of POV Ray. In its original form, it wasn't called that. He says, back in 1986 or so, I had an Amiga. A friend who had an Amiga downloaded the C code from a Raytracer for Unix from the internet and brought it over because this is the sort of thing that they would do. I thought it looked interesting, and I ported it to the Amiga and wrote the drivers to display it with Amiga graphics. He says in a one-off sentence, as if that's another thing that people just do. So obviously there's some interesting knowledge here that I'm jealous of. To be someone that does this in 1986 just sounds like the coolest thing in the world to me. The program only rendered untextured spheres with a planar floor in black and white, but I was still impressed by it. I played with it a bit, adding support for color, but I eventually decided that I could do a better job writing a ray tracer from scratch. So I scrapped the C program and started my own. DKB, which are his initials, I think David Kim Buck. DKB trace had begun. He says, I decided to start with general quadric surfaces since they could represent spheres, ellipsoids, cylinders, planes, and more. I worked out the ray quadric intersection calculations and used some calculus to work out the surface normal to a quadric surface at a point. For the program structure, I decided to use an object-oriented style since I had learned Smalltalk at university, and it fit nicely. To make modeling more flexible, I added CSG and procedural textures. In the end, I had an interesting little ray tracer, and I decided to release it as freeware since I was planning to return to university to start my master's degree, and I didn't have time to develop a commercial ray tracer. Besides, there were already commercial renderers for the Amiga that had user interfaces, not just text files, and I felt I couldn't sell it as a commercial project. I called it DKB Trace and released it to the local BBSs and to the internet, so bulletin boards. Amiga only. And then some time passes, he kind of stays roughly involved, and a guy named Aaron Collins contacts him in 87 or 88 and said he found the C code for DKB Trace and ported it to the PC, personal computer, Windows. He also added a Phong lighting model, so that's a shader model, and a few more goodies. And therefore it just kind of continued and eventually became POV Ray. So persistence of vision ray. So this does ray tracing. So what is ray tracing? It's a rendering technique that calculates an image of a scene by simulating the way rays of light travel in the real world. However, it does the simulation backwards. In the real world, rays of light are emitted from a light source and then strike objects. Some of the light rays then bounce off the objects and enter our eyes, or perhaps a camera. However, most of the rays never reach anything that observes them. They either leave the area of interest or are absorbed by objects within it. Because the vast majority of rays never reach an observer, it would take a very long time for the software to trace even a simple image if the rays were cast as they were in the real world, because almost all the calculations would end up going to waste. We don't see most of that, right? For the purpose of drawing a representation of a scene as viewed from an imaginary camera, we are generally only interested in the rays that reach the camera lens. So a scene is the virtual world which you would wish to take a picture of with our simulated camera. There can be, and usually are, objects in the scene that do not appear in the final image, just as objects outside the field of view of a real camera do not appear in the final image, although you could still see their shadows or reflections. So some things that this does to break out of the, this is a long read and you can go through it, but some things that POV ray tracing does that you may already be familiar with is it's when we turn on lighting enable in Max, right? That is something that traces the way that light reflects off of surfaces, right? So we have all of these things sort of built in that we just turn on, right? But there's a lot behind them. So now we're a little bit privileged in having the ability to just say, well, turn on the lighting, put this shader on. You could even have fog, you know, these sort of things that get rendered in the pipeline. Okay, so I'm going to cut that off a little bit and say that POV Raytracer is also the sort of thing where you type in text and you are delivered a visual scene, right? So again, text-based generation. So we meet at this sort of digital basis with music and virtual worlds where you can generate both in non-real time with a great deal of control because you specify everything in text, right? So a great deal of control, but it's going to take a very long time to render a 3D scene. So it's something we have to appreciate as we watch and listen to Bill Alves and Joran Rudy, that in the 90s, especially when Joran Rudy is doing this, this is crazy town. This is forever. This is something that you don't do with instant gratification in mind. And even the year 2000, when Bill Alves does his piece, Aleph, it's a little bit different. So in reading the liner notes to Joran Rudy, he says, I think it's here, okay, so we're going to watch a piece called Concrete Net. And he says, the images were all generated on Silicon graphics computers using the POV ray tracing program. The generation of each image took up to 12 hours. Depending on the complexity and with 25 frames a second and a duration of 13 minutes, the piece is 13 minutes long, and it took 12 hours to render each image of 25 frames per second. The computation time is considerable, is what he says. The rendering has been running continually on 3 machines for months. Oyvind Hammer's technical and aesthetic contribution to the animation process has been invaluable. So whenever you think things are hard, just imagine it taking half a day to render one picture, and you're going to make a movie that's 13 minutes long. So obviously to do this requires a little bit of patience and also a different way of composing, right? You have to kind of have a artificial way of thinking about things. This is not something you get to be interactive with. You don't get to like render a little bit and then listen and be like, oh, I think I'll change this and this, right? Because that's going to take another 4 days. Okay. So this piece, Concrete Net, let me get the years on it here, is 96 to 97. And all of the works on this DVD, yeah, so the last piece that we won't watch was 1987 to 1995 is when he wrote the piece. And the first piece on this DVD is 92 to 95. So while many of you were not busy being born yet, Joran Rudy is doing what we're about to see. So I had to rip this from the DVD just to ensure that it's going to play well. So I have to find it. Let's see, routine mapping, Concrete Net. Okay. All right, so hopefully this will, let me make sure I'm sharing, share sound.
I'm still stuck on this guy, like writing this ray tracing rendering system for like the Amiga between his bachelor's and his master's. Like, oh, I'm gonna go get my master's. I might as well just release it for free. Like,
yeah, I feel
my mind.
I feel the exact same way. And later, as he worked on it more, because he's just interested in it, he releases it to the world as POV Ray, on the condition that it's always free and it's always open source. Like, he wants nothing from it. That attitude is actually really interesting and drives a lot of what's interesting about digital art in the digital world in general, is that particular attitude. And just the knowledge base this person has, like, oh, well, I took some small talk in university and I know all this math, I suppose, and I've got some free time to burn. I will write some drivers to display the ray tracer on the Amiga graphics.
Well, I feel we talked about this in my lesson yesterday. If I tried selling a plugin to the people in the audio programmer community,
Yes.
they would just be like disappointed.
Yes.
They'd be like, seriously, like, we're literally here for free.
Yes.
All, you know, we're helping you so much. And so I think you're kind of obligated to give it back.
Like, really?
Yeah, I think we came into, like, and I want to say it's digital art too, but I also think it's like very much like it being the Wild West period of the internet.
Yes.
Like, and that's something that I feel like we just came in at the tail end of, and now everything is like monopolized and awful, and websites chastise you for using ad blockers as if it's your responsibility to view their ads.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, well, to date myself a little bit, I guess, which I do all the time, but it was a lot different. It wasn't as easily useful. Right now, it's amazing that I can find anything, right? And in 1992, even 1996, I mean, you could not find anything, right? This was a discovery for them in 1986 to find a ray tracer in C on the internet, right? Oh, someone put that up. That's cool. But now you would find up 10 million of those, right? And you get to choose. So it's actually a different problem of information flood rather than the drought, right? And I think with the cost of that availability, we have something different now. Because before, it just wasn't nearly as organized. I mean, YouTube wasn't, that's not a thing. You know, the corporate infiltration of the internet has had positives and negatives, I would say. I find it amazing. I mean, Google is an amazing thing, right? And the fact that they own YouTube and whatnot makes it very convenient. But we pay a cost for convenience too. And it's always important to remember that. We pay a high price, right? We've lost what the internet was. That doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it does on the dark web. I don't go there.
Which now it's like harder for like child predators to function also. So it's like,
right, there's always
side
a balance
by side.
there.
Yeah, it's a terrible conundrum.
Yeah, I mean, the dark web, yeah, I mean, I struggle with this, right? Because I'm a big believer in freedom of things and especially privacy, but at the same time, you have very bad actors in that same space. It is actually the 21st century American conundrum, right? And I guess worldwide, but really here, because we are supposed to be the beacon of freedom, but we found ourselves not really wanting that so much anymore. Some of us. Okay, anyway, so I sent you the link to this.
I'm ready to watch. I got it. So
yeah, so we'll just tune out for a little bit and watch this on your own. It's 13 minutes, I think.
Can anybody who's interested, can you? I had a comment I was thinking is interesting. 737 in the video,
Yeah.
and you see like the three figures or like textures, I guess.
Yeah.
I thought that was really cool to see that. It's kind of like, and I thought this actually, I really liked the piece. I thought that might be a good place to end it though. But what I thought was, even though it keeps going, it's still great though. I still like it. But now I see a lot of recurrence of the center figure and barely recurrence of the spheres and almost no recurrence of the sticks. And I think it's weird because right here it's calling it, to me, it seems to imply that they're equals. Like, oh, we had 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, but really the reflective mirror paper things were like superfluous throughout. And so I think that it's weird to see this equilibrium here when really it's super lopsided and the paper parts are everywhere. But maybe it's a density thing or like a weight thing.
Right. It's interesting that you point out this particular part because this does show that what we're seeing is not the real-time generation of images or the generation of things. It's that these spaces already exist and we're being taken on a tour of them, right? And I guess he chooses to spend more time in the tour of the silver world.
Well, maybe it's that the silver is never a feature, but it's always there providing the texture. And then we go through the sphere or the stick themes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe it depends. I guess if would it be different if he had if it weren't so tedious to journey through these things? You know, maybe he noticed the same thing. It was like, well, there's no way I'm going back, re-rendering it with a different camera motion.
Yeah, I think it's extremely impressive, though.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy to think about that. Yeah, and you know, I think the result is droney and kind of washy. It's you know, whatever. I like it, but I'm not bored easily. So
I think the music was interesting too.
I really liked it. I think this is one of my favorite ones we've watched.
Oh, great.
I think it's great. Would these be like meshes or points or individual objects?
These would be, yeah, generated objects, right? So you have various primitives, I suppose, in the POV Ray program. The ability, I mean, the same sort of thing we're doing in Jitter, right? You have to make these things.
But would each piece of paper be a point in a mesh, or would they each be their own grid shape?
It may be, I'm not sure, actually. I don't know the answer. I haven't seen the code. My guess would be that they all exist as their own thing, right? Because we are rendering in non-real time. So why not have each one of them have their own texture that reflects the world correctly and all this stuff? So I would guess that each of those things is rendered in code, and you know, it takes forever to render it. All right, so stepping into Bill Alves' world, so now we're jumping into like 2002. So we've left the 1990s. But Bill Alves is using the same program, so POV Ray, free and open source, part of the reason why people are using it, on computers at wherever they have them. And his idea, again, goes back to Whitney. And he says about the piece we'll watch called Aleph that he explored the ways in which Whitney's principles of pattern motion, creating and resolving expectation, could be extrapolated to approaches sometimes not involving differential dynamics at all. He was inspired by ancient Islamic arts of geometric abstraction that find their high point in the intricate tessellations of the Alhambra in Spain or the Isfahan Mosque in Iran. Exquisite frozen examples of Whitney's points of visual resonance. So in other words, they don't move, right? They're tiles. In Aleph, Alves unfreezes these elaborate patterns so that they could form into new ones at points of tonal stability in the accompanying music. So the great philosophical schools of medieval Baghdad and elsewhere in the Islamic world deeply felt the influence of Pythagoreanism and Platonism, attesting to the power of number in music, art, calligraphy, and religious symbolism. So there's a deep involvement here of numbers being a unifying factor. All those things show how Islamic art is built up through patterns of number, starting with the monad unity, which symbolically recapitulates creation when it is extended into 2 dimensions into the circle. The tessellating polygons of the triangle, square, and hexagon, and finally more ornate manifestations. This relates the extension of unity to the first letter of the Arabic alphabet, Aleph. That's the first letter. As the creative ray which initiates existence at the diacritical point of Bay, the second character, and thence proceeds to expand horizontally with the lateral gesture of the second character. So the first character is just a straight line, right? And so what Alves is trying to say is that geometrically we can unfold things in a similar way. By this, the fundamental threefold nature of reality is established. The descent of the light, the expansion into creation, and in the symbolism of the written words of the Quran, the means whereby the light returns to its source.
No.
So sort of a deeply religious symbolism
This
here.
is the introduction to education.
So musically what he
There should be
does,
4 or 5 special education
this
books.
is tough. I'm just gonna, there we go. Wow, not.
How did that work?
Whoa.
This is going to be difficult. There we go.
It's gone.
Okay,
Okay, it's gone now.
that was tough. Okay, so sorry, I got sidetracked. So visually, we have this sort of idea of the unfolding as the Arabic alphabet unfolds, and this sort of relation to how reality is stated in the Quran. And then rather than relying on harmonics or subharmonics to form the basis for just intonation. So here Alves is going to take his he's going to take the relationships of the visual in ratio and translate them into music, as we were talking about before. And to do that, he uses something called hexanes. And we don't have to go into much detail about that. But unlike just intonation, it allows any of the groups of pitches that are defined to be a center. So this sort of shifting idea of what a center is, so this sort of shifting idea of what pattern becomes, they're morphing into each other, is reflected in the music. So he says, in the beginning of Aleph, a formlessness gradually coalesces into visual and musical patterns. Resonant drones are eventually replaced with bell-like tones that follow the mathematical patterns of change ringing. In this English folk art, groups of bell ringers followed strict permutations of the order of a set of bells, so that each ringer follows a path through the successive orders that I envision rather than like the paths that the eye may traverse in following the interlocking weaves of Islamic design. In my version, other attributes such as octave, density, and pitch sets gradually shift together with the changes of the bells. The frequencies of the bell partials are tuned to the same pitches in the hexane then in use, so that the timbres will retain a consonant relationship in the context of the pitch sets. By the time the visual patterns coalesce into striking symmetries, so too do the pitch sets arrive at stable hexanes. In between pitches change gradually from one set to the next, reflecting the visual disorder as one pattern slowly transforms into the next. Okay, so very much a Whitney-like idea. And here is the YouTube link, or Vimeo link, to Aleph. So we can all tune out again and watch Bill Alves' Aleph from 2002.
That was great.
Love that piece.
That's probably my favorite piece that we ever
That was
seen.
incredible.
I love that.
Okay, I didn't like it that much. I thought it was pretty
Oh,
average.
shut up, Ryan.
Now that
I
you
love
guys
it.
are all going crazy for it.
Oh, shut the fuck up, Ryan.
Reminded me of Reich a little bit towards the middle. That was cool. I liked it.
I realized I created a
very
feedback
minimal.
loop earlier.
What is going on? Okay, sorry. The video kept playing in the background. I had no idea what I was hearing. There was something else going on. Okay, so with that, that's all the time we have. I'll post parts of this video, maybe just the first part. But that was our kind of continuing historical journey into what happens when people get personal computers now and are able to render things with text-based programming languages. It does allow for a bit more precision, I suppose, than the real-time world of the 1970s, right? So if we think about what that was to work with the image processor and all those fun things, is very, rich and real-time and visceral. And then we start seeing, Laurie Spiegel, for instance, using digital controls to try to gain a little bit more control over those same systems. And now we've jumped into this, let's have all of this control, but now we lack all of the visceral real-time experience. But this seems to be a recurring trend, I would say a historical pattern, that these things occur, right? So it definitely occurred with music, that in order to make gains, things had to shift to the computer. Well, I guess that's not true. Things did shift to the computer, away from analog, right? Because of the future promise. But sometimes the delayed gratification is a bit necessary. Because there's a lot of power in this, there's also a lot of tedium. Okay, and with that, I will end the class and I will talk to you all later.